The rope burn on Katherine's palms had barely healed when she first saw Jake Xavier working the cattle near her father's ranch. And something in the way he moved, graceful and confident despite the dust and sweat, made her heart forget every warning her mother had ever given her about staying within her social circle. She was 20 years old that summer of 1878, standing on the porch of the sprawling Kendrick estate outside Taylor, Texas, watching the new ranch hand guide a stubborn steer toward the eastern pasture. Her father had hired him 3 days ago, and already the other hands whispered about how quickly he worked, how little he spoke, and how his eyes seemed to hold stories he would never tell. Georgia knew she should not be staring, knew her mother would scold her for even noticing someone so far beneath their station, but she could not help herself. The Kendrick family owned 3,000 acres of prime Texas grassland, 200 head of cattle, and held mortgages on half the businesses in Taylor. Georgia's father, William Kendrick, had built his fortune through shrewd investments and ruthless business practices, and he expected his only daughter to marry accordingly. Already he had introduced her to the sons of oil magnates and railroad tycoons, young men with manicured hands and empty conversations that made her want to scream. Jake Xavier owned nothing but the clothes on his back, a saddle worn thin from years of use, and a horse he had raised from a colt. He was 23, tall and lean with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that fell into his eyes when he worked. When he finally looked up and caught Georgia watching him, he did not look away. Neither did she. That evening at dinner, Georgia pushed her food around her plate while her mother discussed the upcoming social season. Margaret Kendrick had plans, elaborate ones involving balls and garden parties, and carefully orchestrated encounters with eligible bachelors. "The Thompson boy will be back from Philadelphia next month," her mother said, her voice bright with schemes. "His father owns those silver mines in Colorado, very promising." Georgia set down her fork with more force than necessary. "I am not interested in the Thompson boy." Her father looked up from his steak, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "You will be interested in whoever your mother and I decide is suitable. I am 20 years old. I should have some say in my own future." "Your future is secured through an advantageous marriage," William said, his tone brooking no argument. "That is how things work in this world, Georgia. The sooner you accept that, the better." She excused herself early, claiming a headache, and walked out into the warm Texas night. The sky stretched endlessly above her, scattered with more stars than she could count. She could hear the cattle lowing in the distance, the soft murmur of the ranch hands settling in for the night near the bunkhouse. She should not have walked toward those sounds. Should not have found herself near the corral where Jake sat on the fence rail, looking up at the same stars. "Evening, Miss Kendrick," he said without looking at her. His voice was low and rough, like whiskey over gravel. "How did you know it was me? I can hear your footsteps." Light and quick, not like the hands. Georgia moved closer, gathering her skirts to keep them from dragging in the dust. "You should not be speaking to me so informally." "You are right. I apologize, miss." But there was no apology in his tone, only amusement. "I did not say I minded." That made him turn, and even in the darkness she could see his smile, slight but genuine. "Then I will keep doing it." They talked for an hour that night, and then another the next evening and the one after that. Georgia found herself inventing excuses to walk near the corral, to check on horses that needed no checking, to bring water to workers who had their own canteens. The other ranch hands noticed, of course, and whispered among themselves. Within a week, those whispers had reached the house. Margaret Kendrick descended on her daughter like a thunderstorm, her face flushed with fury and mortification. "Have you lost your mind? The hired help? Georgia, what were you thinking?" I was thinking that he is interesting and kind, which is more than I can say for any of the men you want me to marry. Interesting. Kind. He is poor. He has nothing. He has more character than anyone I have ever met. Her mother grabbed her arm, fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. You listen to me, girl. If you pursue this foolishness, you will ruin everything. Your father and I have worked too hard to build this family's position for you to throw it away on some drifter cowboy. But Georgia was already past listening. That night she met Jake behind the stables, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. We should stop this, Jake said, though his hands were gentle as they took hers. I have heard the talk. Your parents know. I do not care what they know. Georgia, I have nothing to offer you. I make $30 a month. I own one change of clothes. Your father could buy and sell me 100 times over. You think I care about that? He pulled her closer, his calloused hands rough against her soft skin. You should. This world is not kind to people who forget their place. Then, maybe we need to find a new place in the world. He kissed her then, and Georgia felt something inside her shift and settle, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. This was what she had been waiting for, what all those empty social gatherings and proper courtships had been missing. Over the following weeks, they grew bolder. Jake would leave notes for her tucked into fence posts. Georgia would slip away during afternoon rides, meeting him in hidden corners of the vast ranch. They talked about everything. His childhood moving from ranch to ranch after his parents died, her loneliness growing up wealthy but isolated, their dreams of something more than the lives they had been born into. The criticism started slowly, then built like a gathering storm. The ranch hands laughed at Jake openly now, mocking him for reaching above his station. The women at church whispered when Georgia walked past, their eyes sharp with judgment. Her mother's friends stopped calling, and invitations to social events dried up like creek beds in August. Sarah Thompson cornered Georgia after Sunday service, her pretty face twisted with false concern. My dear, everyone is talking about you and that cowboy. You cannot possibly think this is acceptable. What I think is that my choices are my own. Your choices are making you a laughingstock. Do you know what they say about you? That you have lost your mind, that you are throwing yourself away on a man who will never be anything but a hired hand. Eleanor Mitchell joined them, her fan fluttering rapidly. Georgia, we are trying to help you. That man is using you. Surely you can see that. He wants your money, your family's position. Jake has never asked me for anything. He does not have to ask, Sarah said, her voice dripping with condescension. Simply being seen with you elevates him. He is probably laughing at you behind your back, telling the other hands how easy it was to turn your head. Georgia felt her hands clench into fists. You do not know him. And you do not know men. They are all the same, dear. They want what they can get, and a poor cowboy wants everything you have. She pushed past them, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Let them talk. Let them whisper and judge and mock. They knew nothing about what she and Jake shared, but the pressure was mounting from all sides. Her father called her into his study one evening, his face grave. This has gone on long enough, William said, pouring himself a whiskey. You will end whatever association you have with Jake Xavier, or I will end it for you. You cannot control who I care about. I can fire him. I can make sure he never works another ranch in Texas. I can destroy him, Georgia, and I will if you force my hand. Why? Because he is poor. Because he works for a living instead of living off family money like the men you want me to marry, her father's face reddened. Because he is not good enough for you. Because you deserve better than a life of hardship and struggle. I deserve to be happy. You are a naive child who thinks love conquers all. Let me tell you what love does not conquer: poverty, hunger, cold, illness. Love does not put food on the table or a roof over your head. Love does not protect you when the money runs out and reality sets in. Georgia stood, her whole body trembling. Then I feel sorry for you, Father. Sorry that you have never known what it is like to love someone more than comfort or money or social position. She ran from the study, from the house, into the night. Jake found her by the creek, crying into her hands. I heard the shouting, he said, sitting beside her on the bank. Georgia, maybe your father is right. Maybe I am being selfish, letting this continue. Do not say that. Do not you dare say that. Look at what this is costing you, your family, your friends, your reputation. Everything. She turned to face him, her tear-stained face fierce in the moonlight. Those things cost me nothing because they were never really mine. They belonged to whoever I was supposed to be, not who I am. You are the first person who has ever made me feel real. Jake pulled her close, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek. I love you, he said quietly. I have loved you since that first day I saw you standing on the porch, looking like something out of a dream, but I cannot stand watching you suffer for it. Then we leave. We go somewhere they cannot touch us. On $30 a month, Georgia, be realistic. I have money my grandmother left me, not much by my family's standards, but enough to start somewhere new. He pulled back, shaking his head. I will not take your money. It is not about taking. It is about building something together. They argued about it for days, but Georgia was relentless. She had never wanted anything as much as she wanted a life with Jake Xavier, and she was not going to let pride or propriety or poverty stand in her way. The breaking point came at the Kendrick summer ball, an elaborate affair her mother had planned for months. Every wealthy family in the region attended, filling the house with silk and jewelry and self-importance. Georgia wore a green dress that brought out her eyes, but her heart was not in the celebration. James Thompson, the silver mine heir, sought her out early in the evening. He was handsome in a soft, well-fed way, with smooth hands that had never known hard work. Miss Kendrick, you look lovely tonight. Would you honor me with a dance? She could see her mother watching, hopeful and calculating. Georgia wanted to refuse, but she was tired of fighting, so she let him lead her onto the floor. I understand there has been some unpleasant talk about you recently, James said as they moved through a waltz. I want you to know that I pay no attention to gossip. How generous of you. He missed her sarcasm entirely. I am prepared to offer for you despite the unfortunate rumors. My father believes the Kendrick land would complement our mining interests nicely. Georgia stopped dancing, right there in the middle of the floor. Let me understand this correctly. You are willing to overlook my damaged reputation because my father's land would be useful to your family business. James looked confused. Well, yes, I thought that was understood. The only thing I understand is that you are exactly as shallow and mercenary as every other man here. She stepped away from him, her voice rising. You do not want me. You want what I represent. You want acres and cattle and social connections. The music had stopped. Everyone was staring now. Georgia, her mother hissed, hurrying over. Control yourself. But something had broken loose inside Georgia, some final restraint that had been holding her in place. No. I am done controlling myself. I am done pretending to care about any of this. She turned to face the assembled guests, all those people who had whispered and judged and mocked. You want to know about the poor cowboy? His name is Jake Xavier, and he is worth more than everyone in this room combined. Not in money, but in everything that actually matters. He is honest and hardworking and kind. He sees me, not my father's bank account or my family's social position, and I love him. The silence was absolute. Then Sarah Thompson laughed, a high, cruel sound. Oh, this is even worse than we thought. She actually believes he cares about her. He probably cannot believe his luck, Eleanor Mitchell added. A rich, foolish girl throwing herself at him. "What will you do when the money runs out?" Another woman called. "When you are living in some hovel while he drinks away whatever you have left." Georgia felt Jake before she saw him. He had come in through the back, still wearing his work clothes, covered in dust and smelling of horses and leather. He should have looked out of place among the crystal and champagne, but instead everyone else looked false and fragile by comparison. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly, ignoring everyone else in the room. William Kendrick stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "You dare to enter my home uninvited." "I dare a lot more than that, sir. I came to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." The gasps and whispers rose like a flock of startled birds. Margaret Kendrick swayed and had to be supported by nearby guests. "You must be insane," William said. "I would never consent to such a match." "Then I am asking Georgia directly in front of all these witnesses, so there can be no doubt about my intentions." Jake turned to her, his dark eyes steady. "I have nothing to offer you but hard work and uncertainty. I cannot promise you comfort or ease or any of the things you are accustomed to, but I can promise that I will love you every day for the rest of my life. I will respect you and partner with you and build whatever kind of life we can together. Will you marry me?" Georgia did not hesitate. "Yes." She heard her mother start to cry, heard the renewed burst of scandalized conversation, but none of it mattered. She crossed the room to Jake, took his dusty, calloused hand in hers, and together they walked out of that glittering ballroom into the warm Texas night. They married 3 days later at the small church in Taylor, with only the minister and his wife as witnesses. Georgia wore a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers Jake had picked that morning. Her family did not attend. Neither did any of her former friends. William Kendrick made good on his threats. He fired Jake immediately and spread word throughout the region that he was unreliable and trouble. He also cut Georgia off completely, telling her she was no longer his daughter and would receive nothing from the family. Georgia used the money from her grandmother's inheritance to buy a small piece of land 40 miles west of Taylor. It was rough country, mostly scrub and hard pan, but there was water and enough grass for a modest herd. Jake sold his horse to buy tools and seed, and they started building. The first months were brutal. They lived in a tent while Jake constructed a rough cabin. Georgia learned to cook over an open fire, to wash clothes in the creek, to work from sunup to sundown without complaint. Her hands, once soft and carefully tended, developed calluses and scars. Her face browned from the sun, and her expensive dresses gave way to practical cotton and denim. They had almost nothing. Some nights they ate nothing but beans and cornbread. Winter came hard, and they huddled together under every blanket they owned, listening to the wind howl around their inadequate cabin. George's back ached constantly from the unfamiliar labor, and there were moments when she wondered if her father had been right, if love really was not enough. But then Jake would hold her in the darkness, his arms strong and sure, and tell her about his plans. He was smart and observant, and he had spent years watching other men succeed and fail in the ranching business. He had ideas about breeding cattle, about rotating pastures, about water management that other ranchers dismissed as newfangled nonsense. "We are going to make this work," he would say. "I promise you, Georgia, this land is going to give us everything we need." She believed him because she had no other choice, because she had burned every bridge and bet everything on this man and this harsh piece of Texas earth. In the spring of 1879, Jake made a trip to San Antonio and came back with 6 odd-looking cattle. They were leaner than the standard breeds, with longer horns and a wild look in their eyes. "What are those?" Georgia asked, staring at the animals. "Our future." These are crossbred with Mexican cattle that can survive on less water and tougher forage. Most ranchers want the big, fat English breeds, but those need too much care, too much water. These can thrive in country like ours. The neighboring ranchers laughed when they saw Jake's scrawny cattle. The same people who had mocked Georgia for marrying beneath her now mocked both of them for their poor business sense. But Jake was right. His cattle survived the hot, dry summer that killed off dozens of the pampered English breeds on surrounding ranches. They multiplied faster, needed less care, and brought nearly as much money at market despite their smaller size. Within a year, Jake had doubled his herd. Within 2, he had begun to earn a reputation among other small ranchers as someone who knew what he was doing. Georgia worked beside him every step of the way. She learned to handle cattle, to mend fences, to keep careful records of expenses and income. She had a head for numbers that surprised both of them, and she began to see patterns in the market, opportunities that others missed. One evening in late 1880, she showed Jake a letter she had drafted to a beef distributor in Kansas City. "I have been tracking the prices," she explained. "If we can get our cattle to Kansas City instead of selling locally, we will make 40% more. Kansas City is 700 miles away. The drive alone would cost more than we would make. Not if we partner with other small ranchers, pool our herds, share the cost of the drive and the drovers." Jake read through her calculations, his respect evident. "You have really thought this through. I learned from the best. You taught me to see opportunities where others see obstacles." They organized a group of 5 small ranchers, all of them struggling to compete with the big operations. The large ranchers like William Kendrick scoffed at their cooperative approach, calling it desperate and doomed to fail. The cattle drive to Kansas City was grueling. Jake went with the herd while Georgia stayed to manage their land. She was pregnant by then, though she did not tell him before he left, not wanting to distract him from the crucial task ahead. Those 3 months while he was gone were the longest of her life. She worked until exhaustion forced her to rest, determined to keep everything running smoothly. She also continued her correspondence with distributors and stockyard managers, building relationships that would serve them in the future. When Jake returned, he brought news that made them both shout with joy. The cooperative drive had been wildly successful. Not only had they received premium prices for their cattle, but Georgia's advanced negotiations had secured them priority placement and lower fees at the Kansas City stockyards. His profit from that single drive was more than he had made in 3 years of local sales. Multiplied across 5 ranchers, the cooperative had proven that small operators could compete with the big ranches through smart planning and collaboration. Jake swept Georgia up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "Why? What is wrong?" he asked, setting her down carefully. "I am pregnant." His face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: joy, fear, wonder, and fierce protectiveness. "When? 5 months. The baby should come in early spring." That night they talked late into the darkness, making plans and dreaming dreams that suddenly seemed possible. They would expand the herd, build a real house, create something lasting for their children. Their son was born in March of 1881, perfect and healthy, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination. They named him William, and if Georgia felt any irony in giving her child her father's name, she did not mention it. The years that followed were marked by steady, careful growth. Jake's reputation spread. Other ranchers began adopting his breeding techniques and land management strategies. Georgia's business acumen became equally respected. She negotiated contracts and managed the financial side of their operation with skill that rivaled any trained accountant. By 1883, They owned 1,500 acres and ran 300 head of cattle. They had built a proper house with glass windows and a real wood floor. They employed 6 ranch hands of their own, and Jake treated them well, paying fair wages and providing decent accommodations because he remembered what it was like to be on the other side. Georgia occasionally heard news from Taylor. Her mother had written once, a brief, stiff letter announcing her father's declining health, but Georgia had not responded. The wound was still too fresh, the rejection too complete. Then, in the summer of 1884, a lawyer appeared at their door with shocking news. William Kendrick had died, and in his will he had left Georgia a small bequest. 1,000 acres of ranch land, the poorest and most remote section of the original Kendrick holdings. He left the bulk of the estate to your cousin Charles, the lawyer explained. But he specifically designated this parcel for you, along with a letter. Georgia took the sealed envelope with trembling hands. Inside, in her father's shaky handwriting, was a single sentence. "You were right and I was wrong. Build something worthy." She cried then, for the father she had lost twice, once to pride and once to death. But she also felt a strange sense of closure, of a circle completing itself. The 1,000 acres her father left her adjoined their current property. Combined, they now controlled a significant piece of Texas rangeland. More importantly, that particular parcel contained something her father had never properly exploited. A series of natural springs that provided year-round water. Jake saw the potential immediately. Water is going to be the key to everything in this country. Whoever controls the water controls the land. They spent the next 2 years developing those springs, creating an irrigation system that allowed them to cultivate crops as well as graze cattle. They grew hay and feed corn, which meant they could maintain their herd through droughts that devastated other ranches. The drought of 1886 was particularly severe. Across Texas, cattle died by the thousands. Large ranches that had overextended themselves financially went bankrupt. Georgia watched from a distance as the same people who had mocked her struggled and failed. The Kendrick estate, now managed by her cousin Charles, was hit especially hard. Charles had none of their father's business sense and had made several disastrous investments. When the drought killed off half his cattle, he found himself deeply in debt with no way to recover. Georgia heard through mutual acquaintances that Charles was preparing to sell the ranch to a consortium of Eastern investors who planned to break it up and sell it piece by piece. She and Jake discussed it late into the night, weighing options and possibilities. "We could buy it," Jake said carefully. "We have the capital now, and the bank would lend us the rest based on our track record. It would be everything we have built. If anything went wrong, we could lose it all. But if it goes right, we would control the largest single piece of rangeland in the county. We could implement everything we have learned on a scale that would transform the entire regional cattle industry." Georgia thought about her childhood home, about the place that had both nurtured and confined her. She thought about her parents, about the life they had wanted for her versus the life she had chosen. She thought about standing in that ballroom 6 years ago, announcing her love for a poor cowboy while everyone laughed. "Let us buy it," she said. "Let us show them what we can build together." The purchase took months to finalize. Charles was initially resistant to selling to his disgraced cousin, but he had no other offers that came close to matching their price. In the end, desperation overcame pride. On a cold December morning in 1886, Georgia and Jake took possession of the Kendrick Ranch. All of it. The grand house where she had grown up, the sprawling acreage, the cattle, the equipment, everything. The same people who had laughed at her, who had mocked her choice and predicted her ruin, now watched in stunned silence as Jake Xavier became one of the wealthiest ranchers in Texas. She and Jake moved into the big house, but they changed it, made it warmer and more welcoming than it had ever been under her parents' ownership. They hosted dinners for the ranch hands and their families, turning the formal dining room into a place of laughter and genuine community. Georgia saw Sarah Thompson at church one Sunday, looking older and harder than her years. Sarah's husband, a cotton broker, had lost everything in a bad investment, and they were living on charity from her parents. Sarah approached hesitantly, her face a mixture of shame and desperation. "Georgia, I wanted to offer my congratulations on your success." "Thank you, Sarah. I also wanted to apologize. For the things I said, the way I treated you, I was wrong." Georgia studied the woman who had once led the campaign to ostracize her. She could have been cruel, could have thrown those old insults back in Sarah's face. Instead, she simply nodded. "We were all young and foolish once. I hope things improve for you and your family." It was not quite forgiveness, but it was grace, and it felt right. Alina Mitchell was not so fortunate. She had married James Thompson, the silver mine heir, in a lavish ceremony that Georgia heard about secondhand. But the silver had run out, and James had proven to be a drunk and a gambler. Alina was trapped in a miserable marriage, living on a fraction of what she had once considered poverty. Too proud to admit her mistake, Georgia felt no satisfaction in their downfall. If anything, she felt a strange sadness for the girls they had all been. So certain that money and position were all that mattered, so blind to what actually sustained a life. By 1888, the Xavier Ranch was the most successful cattle operation in the region. Jake's breeding program had created a line of cattle that thrived in the harsh Texas climate, and ranchers from across the state came to buy his stock. Georgia's business strategies, including direct contracts with Eastern distributors and innovative marketing approaches, had tripled their profit margins. They had 3 children now: William, age 7, Margaret Rose, age 4, and baby James, just 6 months old. They were raising their children to understand the value of hard work and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their station. One evening, Georgia stood on the porch of the house where she had grown up, watching the sun set over the land that now bore her husband's name as well as her own. Jake came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly, "walking away from all of this when you did?" "Not for a single moment. This is not the same place it was then. We built this together, made it into something better. Your father would be proud, I think, eventually. Maybe. Or maybe he would still be horrified that his daughter married a poor cowboy." She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "Do you ever regret asking that girl on the porch to take a chance on you?" "Every day," he said, then smiled at her shocked expression. "I regret that I waited so long. I should have asked you the first day I saw you." She laughed and kissed him, this man who had given her everything by having nothing, who had made her richer than her family had ever been by showing her what actually mattered in life. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of seasons and storms, births and deaths, profit and loss. In 1890, Jake was elected to the Texas Cattle Raisers Association Board, a position of significant influence. He used that influence to advocate for small ranchers, creating programs and resources that helped family operations compete with corporate conglomerates. Georgia became known throughout the state for her philanthropic work. She established schools for ranch children, funded medical clinics in remote areas, and created a lending program that helped young people start their own ranches without being crushed by debt from big banks. In 1892, The governor of Texas visited their ranch to discuss agricultural policy. He stayed for dinner, ate at their table with their children, and later told the newspapers that the Xavier Ranch represented the best of what Texas could be. That same year, Georgia received an unexpected visitor. Her mother, now in her 60s and frail from illness, arrived in a hired carriage, alone and uncertain. Margaret Kendrick looked small and faded, a shadow of the commanding woman Georgia remembered. They sat in the parlor, tea growing cold between them, the silence heavy with years of separation. "I am dying," Margaret finally said. "The doctor gives me perhaps 6 months. I am sorry to hear that, Mother. I came to ask your forgiveness for everything, for not supporting you, for allowing your father to cut you off, for believing that social position mattered more than your happiness." Georgia felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Why now? Why not years ago?" Pride mostly. Fear of admitting I was wrong. But watching your success from a distance, seeing the life you built, the respect you have earned, it made me realize how foolish we were. You found something real with Jake, something your father and I never had. We married for position and property, and we wondered why our lives felt so empty. They talked for hours, carefully rebuilding a connection that had been severed for so long. Margaret stayed for a week, getting to know her grandchildren, watching Jake and Georgia work together with the easy partnership that comes from years of mutual respect. Before she left, Margaret took Georgia's hands in hers. "You were braver than I ever was. You chose love over comfort, and you made it work through sheer determination and intelligence. I am proud of you, even if I never said so before." Margaret Kendrick died 4 months later, and Georgia wept at her funeral, mourning both the mother she had lost and the years they could have had together if pride had not stood in their way. The turn of the century brought new challenges and opportunities. The open range was disappearing, replaced by barbed wire and legal boundaries. The railroad expansion opened new markets, but also brought corporate competition. The world was changing, and ranchers had to change with it or die. Jake and Georgia navigated these changes by staying true to the principles that had guided them from the beginning: innovation, hard work, fair dealing, and genuine care for the land and the people who worked it. They adapted when necessary, but never compromised their values. Their children grew into capable young adults who shared their parents' work ethic and values. William studied agriculture at the State University and came home full of new ideas about soil conservation and crop rotation. Margaret Rose proved to have her mother's head for business and took over much of the financial management. James, still in school, showed promise as a veterinarian, already treating sick animals with skill beyond his years. In 1903, Jake and Georgia celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together everyone who had been part of their journey. Ranch hands past and present, neighboring farmers, business associates, and friends from across the state gathered to honor the couple who had transformed Texas ranching through innovation and integrity. Among the guests was an elderly cowboy who had worked for the Kendrick Ranch back when Jake was first hired. He stood to offer a toast, his weathered face creasing into a smile. 25 years ago, I watched this young man work harder than anyone I had ever seen, and I watched Miss Georgia look at him like he had hung the moon. We all thought she was crazy, throwing away everything for a nobody cowboy. But Jake Xavier was never a nobody. He was just a man who had not had his chance yet, and Miss Georgia saw that when the rest of us were too blind. They built an empire on love and hard work, and they did it while treating every person with respect and dignity. That is something worth celebrating. The applause was thunderous, and Georgia leaned against Jake, her heart full to bursting. Later, when the guests had gone and they were alone under the vast Texas sky, Jake pulled her close. "We did all right, did we not?" he said softly. "We did more than all right. We did exactly what we set out to do. We built a life on our own terms. I love you, Jake Xavier, just as much now as the day I first saw you standing on that porch, maybe more. Definitely more," she said, smiling. "We know each other better now. We have weathered storms together, raised children, built something lasting." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations all those years ago. The ranch continued to thrive under their leadership, and later under the capable management of their children. William took over the day-to-day operations in 1905, implementing new techniques that increased productivity while actually reducing environmental impact. Margaret Rose expanded their business partnerships, opening new markets in the northeastern states and even internationally. Jake and Georgia stepped back from active management but remained involved, offering guidance and wisdom earned through decades of experience. They traveled together, something they had never had time for in the busy years of building the ranch. They visited California and saw the Pacific Ocean, traveled to Chicago and New York, and even took a ship to England. But they always came home to Texas, to the land that had tested and shaped them, to the community they had helped build. In 1910, on a warm spring evening, Jake suffered a heart attack while working in the barn. He was 55 years old and had never slowed down, never stopped working and planning and building. Georgia was with him when he died, holding his hand and telling him all the things she had said 1,000 times before. That she loved him, that he had given her the best life she could have imagined, that she had never regretted a single choice they made together. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Ranchers and cowboys, businessmen and politicians, families who had been helped by Georgia's charitable programs, and young people who had gotten their start through Jake's mentorship programs. They came to pay their respects to a man who had started with nothing and built not just wealth, but a legacy of integrity and innovation. Georgia grieved deeply, but without bitterness. She had had 32 years with Jake, 32 years of partnership and love and building something meaningful together. Many people never had even one such year. She continued his work, managing the ranch alongside her children, establishing a foundation in Jake's name that provided education and resources for aspiring ranchers. She lived to see her grandchildren grow up, to watch the techniques and principles she and Jake had pioneered become standard practice across Texas. On a summer evening in 1925, Katherine Xavier died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 67. She was surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the house that had once belonged to her parents, but had become something entirely different under her and Jake's care. A home filled with love and laughter, a center of community and progress. Her obituary in the state newspapers chronicled an extraordinary life. The daughter of privilege who had chosen love over comfort, who had built a ranching empire through innovation and integrity, who had used her wealth to lift up others rather than elevate herself. But what her family remembered most was simpler and more profound. They remembered a woman who had been brave enough to follow her heart when everyone told her she was foolish. They remembered parents who had loved each other deeply and demonstrated through their daily lives what partnership and respect looked like. They remembered that wealth meant nothing without purpose, that success without integrity was hollow, and that the richest life was one built on love and shared with generous hands. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to what Georgia and Jake had built together. Their story became part of Texas legend. The poor cowboy and the rich girl who defied everyone's expectations and created something that lasted long after the people who had mocked them were forgotten. In the end, Georgia had not just become richer than those who had scorned her. She had built a different kind of wealth entirely, one measured not in acres or cattle or bank accounts, but in lives touched, principles upheld, and love freely given and received. She had proven that the courage to choose your own path, to love without calculation, to build with integrity, was worth more than any inheritance or social position. The land still bears their name, rolling Texas grassland under an endless sky, and on quiet evenings when the wind blows just right, you can almost hear their voices carrying across the decades, speaking of dreams and determination, of love that conquered everything that really mattered, of two people who dared to believe they could build something better and then spent their lives proving it true.